Is this coming through okay? Very good. All right, what is IANDS first? Just a brief overview. Maybe some of you haven't heard about us that much, but I think most of you are aware of the book written by Dr. Raymond Moody back in 1975 called Life After Life, and it coined this term near-death experience. Well, after that book came out, a bunch of people who were professionals, cardiologists, psychiatrists, a couple of others, wanted to do more in-depth research, but the academic community back at that time would not publish their work. So the predecessor to IANDS was formed and started a peer review academic journal, and then IANDS was incorporated in 1981. And with that, we have published a peer review academic journal for almost 40 years. So we've had the outlet to publish that work. And along about that early period of time, people wanted to get together like this and have groups to talk about it. So groups were formed shortly thereafter, and they've been going pretty much all that time. So that's a little bit about who IANDS is. And I'm going to share my path. How did I get involved in all this? I wasn't there at the beginning, but it was sort of coming along to have things unfold in that way. How many here know the work of a Dr. Michael Newton? A couple. All right, I'll just review that briefly. He was a psychotherapist who used hypnosis in some of his sessions with clients. And he had a woman who was a client who was struggling in her life because she had no close relationships. Her parents were deceased at that point. She had no siblings. She didn't have friends. And he was really struggling with he's thinking, well, this is some childhood incident that created a behavioral pattern that made her, have trouble forming relationships. So at one point, he tries the hypnotherapy, and he said, well, go to a time you felt connected. And she became animated, and she's obviously in dialogue with others there, and he's sort of mystified, says, well, where are you? And as she described it, he began to realize she's talking about that time before she came into this life. And they coined the thought of life between life, that we plan major facets of our life before we incarnate. Well, that kind of blew him away. He wasn't ready to deal with that. So after he had 3,000 cases that confirmed that kind of a notion, he wrote a book called Journey of Souls. And so I kind of bring that up because now as I can look back through 7 decades and say, I see how I must have had something to do with choreographing all those sort of independent things that coalesced to bring me along to where I am here. Sort of a confirmation. Another book. Anybody here familiar with a book called Evolution Angel? Okay, that was written by an emergency room doctor. And he wrote it under a pen name, Michael Abrams. His real name now is Ard Todd Michael, and he's come out of the closet. But at the time, as an emergency room doctor, it was a little hard to put this out there. Well, he describes when he was in his youth, in his 20s, he's drifting through life. He had a liberal arts degree. He thought he wanted to be a rock musician. He had a McJob. And he's driving home 3 o'clock one morning, and he falls asleep at the wheel. And he's alone in the car, and he said he felt like physical hands grab his shoulder, and he hears Michael in time to get alert to yank the wheel and just miss a concrete abutment on an overpass. He goes a little further, pulls over, falls asleep. Shortly thereafter, he loses his job, place where he's staying burns down, loses all his personal effects, his girlfriend leaves him. He's sleeping on a cot in a friend's basement, and he comes out one day and he announces he wants to be a doctor. And all his friends and family who know his track record, he has a liberal arts degree, say, yeah, sure, right. Well, somehow he applies himself, does some makeup courses or whatever, and gets admitted, passes the MCATs, gets into med school. And he says as he's going through the curriculum, and he doesn't have prerequisite knowledge from those, pre-med program that he didn't have, he'd be in the library, he's led to the book, I said, why can't we all get that kind of help? You know, that helped him fill in the spaces and get through those courses. He gets to the rotations, and when he comes to the emergency room internship, he says that's his passion. He knows that's what he wants to do with his life. And so now he's written this book 20-some years later. But he's troubled because the goal in the ER is to save lives. And they lose some people. And so he's bothered. He says, well, why do bad things happen to people? Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped the point. Back in that friend's basement when he's having what he felt was a dialogue with what he termed an angel. At one point he asks, well, what's your name? What do I call you? And what came back was, you can call us evolution angel. And the point of that would be, we picture ourselves in terms of identity, human beings. I'm me, you're you. And we think we've got to communicate with an identity. But to them, it was the universe and all the answers they provide. So they agreed to be an identity for him. So he's in the ER, he's losing patients, and he has these dialogues. And he asks the questions, well, why do bad things happen to people? Why aren't all prayers answered? Well, there were two questions he asked which gripped me, and why I'd like to share this and how it applies to what I see as my life coming forward. The first one was, how does the non-physical interact with the physical? The answer he felt he got back was, well, if need be, we can manifest as a mosquito. And as that flies by and your attention's drawn to that, that alters the path of your life going forward from that point, such that you will miss an accident out in the future. Well, my 40-year career was as a systems programmer, software, logic, computers, ones and zeros, truth tables. That's a lot of permutations to think about, that little mosquito and how life can branch out from that point, and that they would think they have that kind of perception for the future. So a little further in the book, he repeats the question for elaboration. How does the non-physical interact with the physical? You remember that example of mosquito? Yeah. Well, let's say instead it's a cloud formation up in the sky. And your attention's drawn to it, you're captured, you're raptured by it, and that has that same effect as it alters the path of your life going forward from that point with the time and attention you give to it. Well, if need be, we can manifest that formation up there as water vapor, cumulus, puffy clouds, or we can make it appear so it's there in your mind and you won't know the difference. This is a stage, not just this thing called life. It's a play. And the basic design element, the ingredient, which is so foundational to this experience called life, is ignorance. Without ignorance, there is no discovery. If you always knew what was around the corner, if you could see like the evolution angels, it would be boring. Why bother? So it's peeling back those layers and having those discoveries of those new experiences. Sometimes they're painful, but they're part of this path and the richness. And so jumping to the end, my philosophy is, well, there is wonderful and eternal and forever. This is ephemeral. This birth, the death, peace, it's this much. My goal is to make the most of it for me and for everybody else that I touch. So, going back to the beginning. From the time I was born until I was about 5 years old, I lived in 15 different caregiver setting changes, locations. The life was just bouncing all around from the family story back then. Started out with, it was right at the inception of my mother and father were married, and my father went off to become a Navy pilot for World War II. And after he left, 9 months later, came my baby sister, or my older sister. No, so he came home on leave, and 9 months later, along came number two, 13 months after my older sister. He got out of the service and wanted to be, well, he tried being home in this rural Pennsylvania environment, northwest Pennsylvania, a little south of Erie. And being an insurance salesman didn't compare to being a pilot. So he got a job with Hawaiian Airlines. And he went off there, and my mother took my older sister and I and joined him. 9 months later, along came baby brother. Well, this was the first time they had diagnosed my mother with postpartum, and she was institutionalized. Shock treatments back then in Hawaii. And they had no idea back in Pennsylvania what was happening, because the communication stopped, and back then my grandparents never would have let this following piece happen, but they weren't involved soon enough. My father, not knowing how to deal with 3 children, 3 and under, gave my older sister to a family, a military family, and gave the baby boy to another family, and then I was to be raised by my uncle. And there's no judgment in this. They did the best they could at the time. My mother got out of the hospital and stayed with the Baptist family, and they felt like she'd gotten a raw deal, because they also, during that time when she didn't have her full capabilities, she agreed to a divorce. So they sent my mother and a social worker to California, where I was living with an uncle. And the story I'm told is the social worker goes to the front door while she went to the back door and kidnapped me out of a high chair. And then we'd be back to Hawaii. Well, by this time, the story has caught up back in Pennsylvania, and they figure things are out of control. They sent a bodyguard to get my mother and me, at that time, the one child left, and bring her back to Pennsylvania. They get her there, and this is rural conservative Pennsylvania. Find out she's pregnant with her 4th child out of wedlock. And this is, divorced, strike number 1, out of wedlock child number 2. So this is part of getting moved all around. We were sent to a family 25 miles away, and she had her 2nd postpartum diagnosis. Now, I think she was also postpartum after mine, from hearing the story of that, but it wasn't diagnosed. So that was my beginning. And what was the outcome of that was, in that sort of a setting as a child, you learn to take care of yourself emotionally, and be self-reliant, and very observant. Always watching what's going around, all the detail. So that was my early training. Now, I don't have time tonight to get in, or today, to get into the rest of this, but 48 years later, in 1997, January, I was able to reunite my older sister with my mother. I discovered her at the end of '96 at a surprise birthday party for another brother. And that would have been an Oprah moment that I'd love to share with you, but it takes 45 minutes to tell just that story. Anyhow, rolling forward from that point, my stepfather came into the picture, and he was my dad from the time I was 5. And he was the rock. His name is Swedrock. That is one of those picturesque moments of fulfillment, of the stability that was needed. She had 4 more children, and after the first 3 of those, she was, again, institutionalized with postpartum depression, and I grew up with that. I have memories of my mother trying to crawl out a car window over my shoulder that's going down the highway as they were taking her to get admitted. And I think I was about 10 at that point. So there's always that little discrepancy in the programming of what somebody says versus what is real. So the little mind said, I can't, it's part of who I am, always has to look at the other side of everything. I think that is a strength in that it gives me the ability to see things from very different points of view and how to blend those together. But let me move forward and go on. So that was a Baptist-like environment for me growing up, independent Bible church in rural Pennsylvania, and I went with that. You know, we did sword drills. Anybody know what a sword drill is? There's a bunch of children on the stage with Bibles, and they call out a Bible verse, and the first person to it, wins the contest. So I did those things as a kid growing up, but I had questions in high school, that alternate point of view, and the answer was, well, you got to take it on faith. That didn't work for me. So I went off to college and left all that other behind, except, for holidays, and when you're home, you go sit in service, be part of the family. So I got to college, married, and after college, got a job, very nice job in the computer field, and my draft board said if you had a student deferment, you went to the head of the line. It was the first year of the lottery, and I had a very high number, but no, I got called in, and I won the second lottery. I'm sitting in this induction center in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and they came out and started calling off some names and said, I don't know, half dozen or so, you go up to room 300, you're now Marines. So I got to spend 2 years in the Marine Corps. But my computer skills helped me stay in a safe environment, except for being part of guard details for funerals for those who weren't that fortunate. So another part of the blending of that path that helped form who I am and my outlook. Got out of the service or back home, the work environment is producing a very nice economic platform for existence. Had 2 children of my own, and it's about 1980. And I have a dentist appointment. And I always tell this with, going to the dentist has always been a little bit like a near-death experience, but that's a different aspect. So I'm at the dentist appointment just for having fillings replaced. The hygienist preps me, rubber dam, cotton rolls, metal clamps, a captive audience. The dentist comes, gives a couple shots of Novocaine, and I don't know if I'd heard the term near-death experience at that point in my life, but it certainly wasn't anything on my, horizons. The dentist talks about how the day before he was shopping for his daughter at a furniture store, and the salesman tells the dentist he'd just returned to work after being hospitalized with a cardiac condition. So the salesman tells the dentist that while he was in the hospital, his heart stopped and they had to revive him with the paddles. And the salesman had this experience of going into the light and meeting beings he recognized as deceased family members. And I happen to look up and I see the hygienist's face as rigid with fear, totally outside her comfort zone. I'm not sure exactly where I was at, but I knew there was something significant to this story. Then it goes on and he says, the salesman, these beings he met who he recognized as deceased family members, introduced him to other beings there, members of the extended family deceased, that he had no prior knowledge of before this event. And after he's resuscitated and recovered and does the research, he authenticates this information he feels he got for the first time in his near-death experience. What we today would call veridical perception, veridical evidence, verifiable after the fact, new information from his experience. Well, the dentist pinches my gums and goes to work and leaves. The hygienist cleans me up, and I have just question marks in the eyeballs because this is before the internet. There's no, well, where do you go with this? It was just the seed that got planted. Time goes forward, and it's August 15th, 1985. And I had a new home in the suburbs. Anyhow, I'd been out mowing the yard. It's a suburb of Rochester, New York, humid. And I come in and I'm washing my hands at the sink. My wife's on the other side of the counter. I have 2 daughters, 6 and 9, somewhere in the area. And the phone rings. And my wife answers. says a few things, and that says, "It's for you, it's your dad," which was code for my stepfather. And I dried my hands, took the phone, and I said, "Hello," and he gave me no preparation. I said, "Hello," he said, "David killed himself." David being my youngest brother, his youngest child. I had no reaction other than complete, immediate grief, sobbing. And in retrospect, I thought, well, if I had a chance, if I knew what was coming, I might have braced that myself rather than having my daughter see their dad. Just now I know it was really the right thing, that they would see an honest, open reaction to this news. Now, my mother was pregnant with my brother when I was graduating from high school, so it wasn't like I was there in the home a lot with him, but it made no difference at that point in time. So Rochester was about a 4-hour drive back to the family homestead in Pennsylvania. So I just put it on hold and drove back to the family. My brother had come home from a wedding, obviously despondent. He's 21. He had tried to be out on his own and had come back home. And I think he just felt like there wasn't anything for him in the future that was like what he'd just been at that wedding. So he went to a high-powered gun cabinet, got a high-powered rifle, and went up to his bedroom and put the muzzle under his chin. My parents are in the living room, right below his bedroom. The noise was thought instantly to be something like a backfire or whatever. My dad went up and said, as he opened the door, "Dorothy, you got to see this." And we say, "Oh, how awful." But I know my mother, if he'd tried to keep her out, she would have fought him tooth and nail, thinking she could have made a difference. So it was instant resolution. The ambulance came that took the body to another town a little ways away. And that's what churches are for. That little white clapboard church was just 1 yard away from our home. Those people showed up, and before I got there 4 hours later, had cleaned up the bedroom. There was nothing left but a bullet hole in the wall, which covered up by a picture. That's what churches are for, community. It's not so much the belief, the doctrine, and all that. It's what and who we are for each other. So I spent the week there. It's going to be a closed casket service all the way through internment. And then I finally get home, and I call my confidant at the time was my mother, or my stepmother. And she said, "You need to say goodbye to your brother." And I realized other than that initial grief, I hadn't really done anything except put it on hold. And so I found some quiet time. Wasn't necessarily a practicing meditator back then, but I had a recliner in the bedroom, and I feel the fabric every time I tell this. As I reclined it and I closed my eyes and I let the thought go through my mind, "Goodbye, David." Instantly, my consciousness went back to Pennsylvania, back to that neighboring town. This is a little graphic for a moment, but bear with me. To that funeral home, to the back of the funeral home where I'd never been physically, to a casket sitting on top of a gurney. And I'm thrust through the side of that casket into the space on the torso where there should be a face, and I'm bilocating. I'm aware of my body back in that easy chair, just thrashing from the terror, the horror, the ghastly nature of this. At the pinnacle of this, a male voice, not a thought, a male voice, a different tone completely, spoke into my mind as though there was somebody 3 feet away and said, "He's not here." And with that, there was perfect peace, perfect calm. I'm united with my body. And certainly processing that going forward in time is where I lost my fear of death. But then I think, well, wait a minute. I'm struggling in life. I would like a little help, a little direction. I can speak into my mind in plain English. Why can't I get that a little more often? You know, a little help here, huh? Why do I have to struggle so hard? But it certainly was a significant event for what I needed. My marriage had been struggling at that point in time, and I thought that this was going to help save it, but it didn't. We'd go to counseling. I'd say, I want to save this, being the true Christian model that marriage is forever. And she'd say, no. And so we do that a couple times, and they'd say, well, what do you do? I had vowed that my kids would not come from a broken home, and now I have to face the consequence. I can't do anything about it. Personally, alone, it's too late or whatever. But I found a book that said the best thing you can do for your children in this kind of a situation, 2 girls, 6 and 9, no matter what the issues were, and there were some significant ones, is to love their mother. So I made sure that my children didn't know the background. Just we were going to get through the best way we could. But I was struggling, and I had hit a wall. Emotionally, just totally, who am I? I'm a failure. There's a big D branded on my forehead now. I can't be that person I thought I was. So I found a group in Rochester, New York called Neutral Ground. And I walked into my first meeting, there's 100 people or more in that room, all with that same condition. And I thought, wow, you know. And they did support groups. And so I started attending. And 6 months later, I took the training to be doing those support groups for others. Now, could that not be a significant feature of what brought me to be able to do what I do here today and for IANDS and running support groups for people who've had incredible experiences or people who are just interested in this subject and want to know more. So that was, again, one of those things that dropped into my life that really makes a significance for me to be here today and do what I do. So after that period of time, rolling forward a year and a half, my childhood sweetheart was a woman who was in 9th grade at the time while I was a senior, and her father said, no way. So, but at this point, after my first marriage, 17 years, it ended, and this intervening gap, she was divorced and had 2 boys. We started communicating, got together, and then I formed that second marriage. And at that time, also intervening with that was I had this realization I did need something in my life which was more of the spiritual nature. So where do you go? You go back to where you're planted. So this is before the getting together with my second wife, but you go to a church like the one you grew up in. It was big, it was families, it was spiritually, it fed me. But the doctrine, the boxes, they didn't work. There was still something that didn't resonate. And then I met a person who went to this other church in Rochester called Unity. And so I tried the Unity Church, and that was a fit. I could go there and feel, fed spiritually. And I'm there going for a few, maybe not quite a year. And they said, we're going to have this man come and speak to us a couple of weeks out. One afternoon, he's going to tell us about his near-death experience. Boom. I'm going to hear somebody first person talk about this experience, not hearing a secondhand story. So I showed up that afternoon to hear, how many have heard the name Tom Sawyer, and not Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer? Tom Sawyer was a highway employee, a suburb of Rochester. He was pinned under his truck for 15 minutes before they got it off, or so before they got it off of him, and he had his near-death experience. Tom was studied by some of the founders of IANDS, Ken Ring especially. Ken Ring ran what was called the Near-Death Hotel at the university, near University of Connecticut, where he worked. Ken was a psychologist. And Ken said that about Tom was one of the most significant psychics after a near-death experience he ever studied. And so when I was there listening to Tom tell his experience, it was like 2 jaw-dropping hours of the most incredible story. So there's a couple of books, What Tom Sawyer Learned from Dying, and then a follow-on companion book, which if you're interested in that kind of depth and detail, they will take you into one of the most amazing stories there are in this genre. Well, anyhow, I'm into my second family. We're going to a Unity church. Well, I have 4 kids now, my 2 daughters and 2 stepsons, but the Unity church had no youth program. I mean, there were maybe 4 or 5 kids between kindergarten and my kids' ages, and I was a summer league soccer coach, and this other family there, they said, well, you ought to come to our church. We have this youth minister that the kids just love. He's a Pied Piper for kids. And, okay, well, we'll try it out. And they did. They loved him. And you know what kind of church that was, of course. They loved the youth pastor, but it was another independent Bible church with 3,000 people attending. 1,000 members, and there I was in this quandary again. Okay, you go with the roll of the dice. I said, I'd like to be an adult helper in the youth program. Okay. Said, you got to sign this piece of paper. It was a doctrinal statement. This is our beliefs, core beliefs, and what you have to. I said, well, I can put ink on paper, but that's not me. So I couldn't do that job. So they let me volunteer in the nursery, 2 and 3 years olds. I can't pollute them theologically, right? Hey, good, I loved it. It was terrific. On my Sundays, I'm there, I look forward to it. Well, they got a new Christian ed director who wanted to do flannel board stories in the nursery. You know what flannel board stories are? You put the whole... Along came the doctrinal statement, so I got kicked out of the nursery. There is one job you can have in a church that's theologically neutral. You can be an usher. You hand out the bulletins, show people their seats, you clean up afterwards, and I was really good at it. I worked my way up to head usher in the first service. So, one Sunday morning, the kids are kind of dawdling, and I said, I got responsibilities. I got to go. Now, our house was 12 miles from the church, practically out of our development, 7 miles due south, hit a stop sign, turn right, 5 miles west. So it's all suburb of Rochester, New York, 40, 45. And this is early Sunday morning. I said, well, when they're ready, you take the other car and come. I got responsibilities. I got to go. And that notion you can make up a few minutes with the accelerator, I'm doing a little over the speed limit, 10, 15. I mean, it's early Sunday morning. Nobody's on the road. So after I leave the development, about the 1 mile mark, a group of birds, 4 or 5, about the size of a sparrow, whatever, are flying across the path of the car from the left to the right, and I have to jump on the brake to keep from hitting the birds. Okay, and I speed back up. My mental marker of about 3 miles, this has happened at least 3 times, and I think maybe 4, but I know it happened 3 times. And then finally it comes, well, I guess I'm supposed to go the speed limit. I really didn't process it, but I kept going. Down around 5-6 mile mark on the 7 mile jaunt, I'm out in the country. It's cornfields. It's a quarter of a mile between houses. Down goes the accelerator, out comes another group of birds, and that's just past my coincidence threshold. What? I'm going below the speed limit. What? I don't know how to make sense of this, but I know this is something that had never happened once before, let alone that many iterations. So at the stop sign, I turn right, and as I'm coming up on about the 1 mile mark going west, up ahead I see there's a car off the road to the right on its roof. It's in a little culvert down from the shoulder of the road, and the rear end is canted my directions, and the rear wheels are still spinning. And this is one of those moments when time just kind of freezes, and I'm thinking, I'm not first responder trained. I wouldn't carry one of those new cell phone gadgets. I was still on the pager. And there was 2 white vans pulled off to the left, and the drivers are getting out of their cars. And in the yard next to where the car is flipped over, the yard next to it, someone's coming out the front door of the house. So my personal assessment is I have nothing to contribute here. And I pulled over and went very slowly by, as I'm in shock. My philosophy was, you do dumb things, you deserve the consequences. Why was I could make no other conclusion, but those birds were sent to keep me from either being in an accident or on the scene sooner. And it indelibly is in my mind that happened, but the explanation for it eludes me somewhat. And then, going forward in time, as I think back on that, I realize the activity of those birds was precognitive, was happening well in advance of the unfoldment of events on that road. So whatever this vision is that's over us, like in terms of the evolution angel now, I can look back on and say there's some empirical evidence for that being a reality. So I had to conclude that meant something significant. However, in this period of time at this church, this huge church, then I was in adult Bible studies and I was part of that system. These adult Bible studies, I would try to bring in information about near-death experiences. I mean, I knew about Tom Sawyer's story. In 1996, I actually joined IANDS as a professional member so I could get the journal. And I was learning more about that and meeting more. But there was no receptivity in this community for that information. And I was isolated. And not often, but very occasionally would hit a depressive wall, which depression was, why is this so real to me and certain to have meaning, but no one else is interested? I can't pull in any conversation with others to make sense. They eventually told me they didn't want to hear any more about that. I mean, and I shared with them Howard Storm's story. I don't know if any of you know Howard Storm, but he was an atheist who, after his near-death experience, actually turned around and became a Christian pastor. And no, it just couldn't get past the wall. So I'm in this one of these depressions, and the time frame, as I recall, is past spring. It's early summer. I know it's a warm weather time, and that's significant to this event. Several days in a row, I start to have this song, a very familiar song, in my mind. And have you heard of Anthony Sikoria? He composed what's called the Lightning Sonata. He was hit by lightning, and after his near-death experience, started hearing classical music. And he said it was like a petulant child. If he didn't pay attention, it would get louder. And then eventually he started trying to pound it out on a piano, and then took piano lessons, and now has composed the Lightning Sonata. Well, this song that was familiar was there in my mind for a couple of days in a row, but I couldn't quite place it. So I'm at work one day, and I leave my cubicle to go back to the printer to get a report, and that song starts playing again. I thought, what is that song? And it came to me, it was Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. I thought, what? I don't even like that song. Where did that come from? Out of the middle of nowhere. And then I started listening to the lyric, or playing the lyrics in my mind. They wouldn't let poor Rudolph play in any reindeer games. Oh my gosh, it was a message. I was meant to look into that. And then I rolled those lyrics a little further. One foggy Christmas. Oh no, it's a mission. It was a purpose for what I was doing. That was even a little harder to take. It was, I'm meant to be something significant in this, this era that I'm having no impact at that moment. So, that was, again, from an evolution angel sense, they were keeping me in tune. So, a little while later, this is after the birds, and I've established in my mind that those were animals, or, that was used as an intervention for me. That little boyhood church back in Pennsylvania was without a pastor. And I agreed to be pastor for a Sunday. I'm going to drive down and take over the, I don't know what I'm going to say, but I agreed to go down and do that. And I got into it, and I'm thinking about what I'll, so I'll just tell something like I'm doing here, but a little more toned down about my encounter with near-death experiences. And I'm thinking about the music too, because I'm really into music then, and I had some contemporary music that came out of this new church. The one beauty of that big, huge church I was in is they were right connected with the University of Rochester music program, which was very significant. And so we had some musical artists which were top shelf. So I'm thinking about what music I'm going to play when I get there and all. So I'm on the highway and I'm driving down Route 90, the expressway to Pennsylvania. And I have this real positive energy in what I'm going to be able to do for this service. And I'm not speeding, but there's a sickening thud as I hit an animal. And I know that animal has given its life. There's no question in my mind. I was like a small dog or whatever. And that totally deflated me. Everything I'm thinking about at that point in time was, now I can't accept the birds as some sort of beneficent intervention, and now this as being unrelated. But I couldn't figure out what it was about that I should take in. It's just, I was hoping nobody's going to show up or whatever. I'm not really keen or tuned in to what I'm going to be doing the next day. So the next day comes up, and the service has started, and I'm hoping nobody will show, It was in the May time frame, and there was actually snow the day before, and I thought, well, good. But it takes off, and then their service was, the adult Sunday school program was first, which I was going to be leading. And what I did was I took the passage from the Bible of, I forget what chapter, but 3 different editions, the King James Version, and then NIV, New Version, and then the Message, which was a very contemporary interpretation of the Bible. I thought, well, we'll just read through this and look at the differences. And it went very well, and it was a very energetic kind of exchange, and it wasn't difficult. Okay, so then there's the break, and we're going to have the service. As the service starts, they have a song leader get up, and it was an elderly gentleman. To me, at that time, elderly was different than what it looks like now. No, I'd say he was in his 80s. He couldn't carry a tuna in a bushel basket. And I realized that if I'd charged in there with my program, that man would not have been able to give his gift. While he maybe wasn't musically inclined, it was his opportunity to take some time, to lead the music. And so I didn't take over the music as part of doing that program. I just got up and I was sharing from the pulpit a little bit of what I've shared here. My mother's in the service, so she's hearing some of this. And I describe hearing the voice after my brother's suicide. And she stands up in the middle of the service. Now, my mother was a closet. She would have loved to have been a minister, but the female programming is not allowed in that environment, so she really couldn't. But she stood up in the middle of that service, and what she announced for the first time to anyone in public was, in the weeks following my brother's suicide, she woke up one morning with Jesus and my brother at the foot of her bed. And she said, my brother was trying to come to her, and Jesus put his hand on my brother's shoulder and said, not now, David. And so she was able to see that. And that was her. I mean, that didn't take the grief away, but it was her comforting. And the beauty of being able to share that in open, in public. I think that it had two wonderful messages and blessings for many. And it's just been an incredible life. So I started going to IANDS conferences then. And I was kind of making my own way now to get more connected to this. And I went to my second conference in Chicago. And I'm on the way back from that. And actually that's where a couple of the leaders of IANDS kind of took note, because I've been trying to start a group in Rochester, and they asked me to come onto the board. And I'm trying to share all this enthusiasm with my wife. And I didn't have 2 or 3 sentences out of my mouth because she didn't want to go to the conference. So I dropped her off at her sister's in Ohio on my way to Chicago. And I picked her up on the way home. And she listens to me for a little, just a brief amount of it, and says, well, what's in it for me? And it was just total wow. And that was the beginning of the end of that marriage. I mean, it wasn't anything that, but I realized at this point in time that there are points where we have different paths. And that's where we chose different paths from that point. So I had 2 17-year marriages. I think I'm prepared now. Maybe I can get it right next time. But so I became involved in IANDS, and I spent from 2006 to 2011 on the board in the role of groups coordinator for the U.S. area. And then since then, I've been here. I moved to Arizona after I retired 2007, 2008, moved to Arizona. And there's no more misdefined word in the English language than the word retired. I have never worked harder in my life without pay. But, you know, I'm basically 24/7 devoted to this field and making a difference wherever I can. So I want to thank you for, you know, listening to that little life story thing. And if there's any questions, you know, I'd like to be able to entertain